This is the story of an ordinary family dinner shattered by one innocent question from a young son. A question that seems harmless on the surface, but strikes at the exact center of a secret the father has spent years, maybe decades, burying. What follows isn't a dramatic explosion, but a slow unraveling. Silence at the table, a mother's frozen expression, a father's hands stopping mid-motion. From that single moment, the story peels back layers of a hidden past. A past life, a hidden child, a buried crime, or a secret identity that the father must finally face, not because he chose to, but because his own son unknowingly forced the door open. The kitchen smelled like garlic and butter, warm bread cooling on a wire rack, the low hum of a football game drifting from the living room television nobody was really watching, forks scraped gently against ceramic plates. A pot of stew simmered on low, filling the small house with the kind of comfort that only Sunday dinners seemed to hold. David sat at the head of the table, sleeves rolled to his elbows, laughing at something his wife Claire had just said. Their son, Noah, 8 years old and swinging his legs beneath his chair, poked at his carrots without much interest. He had that look children get right before they say something they don't know is dangerous. Distracted, innocent, unaware of the weight some questions carry. "Dad," Noah said, not even looking up, "who's Emily?" The room did not explode. There was no shattering glass, no raised voice, just silence, thick, sudden, and absolute. Claire's hand stopped halfway to her water glass. David's fork hovered over his plate, motionless, his knuckles pale around the handle. His face didn't change so much as it emptied, like something behind his eyes had quietly closed a door. Noah looked up, confused by the stillness he'd created. "Where did you hear that name?" David asked quietly. And just like that, an ordinary Sunday cracked open. 3 weeks earlier, mornings in the house had followed the same gentle rhythm they always did. Claire's alarm went off at 6:15, the coffee maker gurgling to life, before she'd even left the bedroom. David would already be downstairs by then, standing at the counter in yesterday's t-shirt, scrolling through emails he wouldn't answer until 9. It was a small ritual, unspoken and unbroken, the quiet choreography of 14 years together. Noah would thunder down the stairs 2 steps at a time, backpack half-sipped, hair uncombed, asking if there were waffles. There usually were. Claire made sure of it, the way she made sure of most things. Packed lunches, permission slips, the school calendar taped to the fridge in her careful handwriting. David drove Noah to school on Tuesdays and Thursdays, radio tuned to whatever song Noah wanted, the two of them singing badly and without shame. On weekends, there were soccer games on muddy fields, popcorn at the Dollar Theater, board games that always ended in Noah's triumphant, slightly unfair victory. To anyone watching from the outside, they were unremarkable in the best possible way. A husband who remembered anniversaries, a wife who still laughed at his jokes after all these years, a son who believed, the way only children can, that his parents had always existed exactly as he saw them, whole, simple, without histories that predated his own. There was no reason to look closer. No cracks in the paint, no strange phone calls, no nights spent in separate rooms. Just a family, ordinary in content, standing on ground they didn't yet know was hollow beneath them. If you asked anyone who knew David, they'd describe him the same way, steady, reliable, the kind of man who showed up early, stayed late, and never made a thing about it. He ran a small contracting business out of a rented office above a hardware store, and he'd built it from nothing over 12 years, brick by brick, the same patient way he built everything else in his life. But there were things about him that people noticed and never quite questioned. The way he flinched, almost imperceptibly, whenever someone mentioned Ohio, though he'd lived there once, briefly, before Claire. The way his jaw tightened if a stranger's name happened to be Emily. An ordinary name, common enough that it shouldn't have meant anything. The way he kept a small metal lockbox in the back of his closet, the key to which he wore on a chain tucked beneath his shirt, against his skin day and night, for as long as Claire had known him. She had asked about it once, early in their marriage. Old paperwork, he'd said, not quite meeting her eyes, nothing important. And because he said it so evenly, so casually, she had let it go. That was David's gift, really. The ability to close a door so gently you never heard it lock. He was a good father, patient with Noah's endless questions about dinosaurs and space and why the sky was blue, present at every game, every recital. But every so often, Claire would catch him staring at nothing, somewhere far past the walls of their home, his expression unreadable, his thoughts clearly elsewhere. She never pushed. She loved him. And love, she told herself, didn't require excavation. She would come to regret that belief. The stew had been Claire's mother's recipe, passed down and slightly altered over the years, a little more paprika than the original called for, a habit David had never questioned because he loved it that way. He'd come home a little later than usual, dust still clinging to his forearms from a job site across town, and he'd kissed Claire on the cheek before washing up, the same small gesture he performed almost without thinking, the way people do when affection has become muscle memory. Noah had set the table without being asked, proud of the responsibility, carefully placing forks on the correct side the way his mother had taught him, humming some tune from a cartoon he'd been watching earlier. The television in the living room played on low, forgotten, a commentator's voice rising and falling over a game none of them cared about. "How was the site today?" Claire asked, ladling stew into bowls. "Good," David said. "Foundations poured. Should be framing by Thursday. Did you see Mr. Halloran? Noah wants to know if his dog had puppies yet." David smiled, the easy, unguarded smile that Claire had fallen in love with years ago. "Not yet. Any day now, though." Noah perked up at that, launching into a rambling explanation of what he would name a puppy if given the chance. Something involving dinosaurs, inevitably. And Claire laughed, shaking her head, reaching over to smooth his unruly hair. It was, in every way, an evening like 100 before it. Comfortable, familiar. The kind of night that blurs into all the others in memory, forgettable precisely because nothing was wrong. Noah took a bite of his carrots, chewed thoughtfully, and set down his fork. He'd found something earlier that day. Something small, tucked away where he wasn't supposed to look. And children, unlike adults, rarely understand the difference between a question that is safe to ask and one that isn't. "Dad," Noah said again, once the silence had stretched long enough that even he understood something had shifted. "I found a box in the garage, behind the paint cans. It had a photo in it." David set his fork down slowly, deliberately, the way a man moves when he's buying himself time to think. "What kind of photo, bud?" "A lady and a little girl. On the back it said Emily, age 4. Noah frowned, genuinely puzzled, still too young to read the temperature of the room around him. "Is that my cousin? I didn't know I had a cousin." Claire's water glass sat untouched, her fingers still curled around it but frozen, as though moving might make whatever was happening more real. She looked at David, not accusingly, not yet, just searching. The way you search a familiar face for a stranger you've suddenly realized might be living inside it. "Whose box was that?" she asked quietly. Her voice was even, controlled, the voice of someone determined not to unravel in front of their child. "David, whose box?" David didn't answer right away. He was looking at Noah, at the open, guileless curiosity on his son's face, and something in his expression cracked, not into anger, but into something closer to grief, old and familiar, something he had clearly carried and hidden for a very long time. "It's not important," he finally said, though the words came out hollow, unconvincing even to himself. "Finish your dinner." But Noah, sensing now that he had stumbled into something enormous without understanding what, pressed on with the fearless persistence only children possess. "Who's Emily, Dad? Is she real?" The question hung in the air like smoke that wouldn't clear. Claire stood up from the table without a word, her chair scraping loudly against the floor, and walked out of the room. David watched her go, didn't follow, and for a long moment simply stared down at his hands as though they belonged to someone else, someone with a past he had spent years trying to bury under waffles and soccer games and Sunday stew. The kitchen clock ticked louder than it had any right to. Somewhere in the living room, the forgotten television murmured on, a commentator's voice rising over a touchdown nobody in the house cared about anymore. Noah sat very still, his fork resting against the rim of his bowl, watching his father with the particular wariness of a child who understands, without yet knowing why, that he has done something irreversible. "Dad," he said, softer this time. David didn't look up immediately. He was staring at the space where Claire's chair had been, at the faint indentation her body had left in the cushion, as if he could somehow reverse the last 2 minutes by sheer force of concentration. His hands, still resting on the table, had begun to tremble slightly, not violently, just enough that Noah noticed, enough that it frightened him more than any shouting could have. "Am I in trouble?" Noah asked, his voice smaller now, uncertain. That seemed to pull David back into the room. He blinked, exhaled slowly, and reached over to rest a hand on his son's shoulder. "No," he said. "No, buddy, you didn't do anything wrong." But his voice didn't sound like his own. It sounded like a man reading lines from a script he hadn't had time to memorize, each word placed carefully to avoid stepping on something buried just beneath the surface. Upstairs, a door closed. Not slammed, just closed, deliberately and quietly, which was somehow worse. Noah looked toward the ceiling, then back at his father, searching his face for an explanation that wasn't coming. David sat there a long moment, the stew going cold in front of him, the weight of 14 years of silence finally, unavoidably beginning to break. "It's getting late," David said finally, glancing at the clock as though it had just occurred to him, though it was barely 7:30 and Noah's bedtime was still an hour off. "Why don't you go get ready for bed?" Noah blinked. "It's not even—" Noah. The word came out sharper than David intended, and he caught himself immediately, softening his voice, forcing something that resembled a smile onto his face. "Please, I'll come tuck you in soon, okay? We'll talk about the dinosaur names for the puppy, I promise." It was a clumsy pivot, and both of them seemed to know it. But Noah was 8, and 8-year-olds, however perceptive, are still inclined to trust the shape of their father's voice when he asks for something gently enough. He slid off his chair, hesitated a moment as though he might ask again, "Who's Emily?" But something in David's expression stopped him. He turned instead and padded off toward the stairs, throwing one last uncertain glance over his shoulder before disappearing up into the dark. Alone now, David sat at the table, staring at 3 bowls of stew slowly losing their warmth, at a scene of ordinary domestic life that had, in the span of 5 minutes, become something unrecognizable. He pressed the heels of his hands against his eyes and exhaled a long, shuddering breath. The photograph. He should have burned it years ago. He'd told himself, over and over, that the box was safe where it was, high on a shelf, behind paint cans no one had a reason to move. He had built an entire life on the assumption that some doors, once closed, simply stayed closed. He understood now, with a dread that settled cold and heavy in his chest, that he had been wrong. Some things did not stay buried, they waited, and eventually, one way or another, they always found their way back to the surface. The bedroom door was closed but not locked, and the house was quiet enough that every word carried further than either of them intended. Claire stood by the window, arms crossed tight against her chest, staring out at the dark street below as though the answer to everything might be waiting somewhere out there in the shadows of the neighbors' porch lights. "You told me it was finished," she said, not turning around. Her voice was low, controlled, but it trembled at the edges like ice about to crack. "You told me, David, years ago. You said the box was old paperwork. You looked me in the eye and you said that." David stood near the door, hands hanging useless at his sides, the posture of a man who knew there was no version of this conversation he could win. "I didn't lie to protect myself," he said quietly. "I lied to protect all of us, you, Noah." "Don't." Claire finally turned to face him, and her eyes were wet, though her jaw was set with something harder than sadness. "Don't you dare say her name like she's some kind of accident you were shielding us from. I've known there was something, David. I've known for years. I saw the way your whole body changed whenever her name came up. Whenever we drove past a certain exit on the highway, whenever the calendar hit a particular week in October. I let it go because I loved you, and because I told myself that whatever it was, you would tell me when you were ready." Her voice cracked slightly on the last word. "I didn't think ready would take 14 years. I didn't think our son would be the one to drag it out of the dark." David opened his mouth, then closed it again, the words failing to arrange themselves into anything adequate. There was a version of the truth he owed her, had owed her for over a decade, and standing there in the dim light of their bedroom, he understood with sudden, sinking clarity that the time for deciding when to tell her had just been taken out of his hands entirely. "I'll tell you everything," he said finally. "Tomorrow, I promise. Just not tonight, please." Claire said nothing. She simply turned back to the window, and the silence that followed was worse than anything either of them could have shouted. Sleep did not come easily to Claire that night. She lay on her side of the bed, David's breathing beside her too careful, too deliberate to be genuine rest. And she let her mind drift back through years of small, unexplained fractures she had never allowed herself to examine too closely. There had been the wedding, 7 years into their relationship, when David had insisted, quietly but firmly, on a small courthouse ceremony instead of the wedding Claire had once dreamed of. No explanation offered beyond a vague discomfort with big gatherings. There had been the life insurance paperwork years later, where David had paused so long over the beneficiary section that Claire had eventually filled it out herself, assuming exhaustion. There had been the Christmas he'd disappeared for 6 hours without a phone call, returning pale and silent, offering only traffic as an excuse, though the roads that day had been clear. And there had been October. Always October, a week where David grew distant, short-tempered, prone to staring out windows at nothing. She had once suggested a trip somewhere warm during that week, a way to shake him out of whatever fog descended on him annually, and he had refused so abruptly, so out of character, that she'd never brought it up again. She thought now of the photograph Noah had described, a woman, a little girl, the name written carefully on the back in handwriting that wasn't David's, Emily, age 4. If the girl in that photo were real, if she had aged the way children do, she would be a grown woman by now. Old enough to have a life David knew nothing about. Or worse, old enough that David had known about it all along and had simply chosen, deliberately, year after year, not to be part of it. The thought settled in Claire's stomach like a stone. Not simply a secret from his past, she realized. A choice. An ongoing, active choice, made and remade every day for as long as she had known him. She closed her eyes, but the picture in her mind only sharpened. A name, a birthday, a box hidden behind paint cans, and a marriage she was no longer certain she fully understood. Morning came gray and quiet, the kind of light that made everything in the house look slightly unfamiliar. Noah had been sent to school early, dropped off by Claire with a kiss and a promise that everything was fine, a promise that felt thin even as she said it. By the time she returned, David was already sitting at the kitchen table, the same table in the same chair, a cup of coffee cooling untouched in front of him. He looked like a man who hadn't slept because he hadn't. "Sit down," he said, "please." She did, arms crossed, bracing herself for whatever was coming. David was quiet for a long moment, turning his coffee cup slowly in his hands, and when he finally spoke, his voice was steadier than she expected. The voice, she realized, of a man who had rehearsed this confession in his head 1,000 times over the years, and never once found the courage to say it aloud. "Before I met you," he began, "I was married. Briefly. I was 23, and it was a mistake almost from the beginning. 2 people who confused loneliness for love and got married before either of us understood the difference. Her name was Rachel. We had a daughter, Emily." Claire's breath caught, but she said nothing, letting him continue. "The marriage fell apart before Emily turned 2. Rachel moved back to Ohio to be near her family, and I." He stopped, his jaw tightening, the old guilt visibly resurfacing after years of careful burial. "I let her go. I told myself it was because Rachel and I couldn't be in the same room without it turning into a war, and Emily didn't need to grow up in that. But the truth is simpler and uglier than that. I was ashamed. I was 24 years old with a failed marriage and a daughter I didn't know how to be a father to, and instead of fighting for a relationship with her, I ran. I sent money. I sent birthday cards for a few years. And then, eventually, out of guilt or cowardice or both, I stopped even doing that. Just perfect." "Why didn't you tell me?" Claire's voice was barely above a whisper. "Because every year that passed made it harder to say out loud. At first it was, 'I'll tell her before we get married.' Then it was, 'I'll tell her before we have Noah.' Then Noah was born, and I thought, if I tell her now, she'll wonder what kind of man walks away from one child and stays for another. She'll wonder if I'll do it again." He finally looked up, his eyes red-rimmed, raw in a way Claire had never seen. "I didn't lie because I stopped loving Emily. I lied because I couldn't survive watching you look at me the way I already looked at myself." The kitchen was silent except for the low hum of the refrigerator. Claire sat with the weight of it, the shape of 14 years rearranging itself in her mind. Every October, every flinch, every closed door finally making a terrible, coherent kind of sense. "Is she still in Ohio?" Claire asked finally. "Emily?" David nodded slowly. "As far as I know, she'd be 26 now." "Then," Claire said, her voice quiet but resolute, "I think it's time you found out for certain." They told him that evening, sitting together on the edge of his bed. The three of them crowded into the small room that still smelled faintly of crayons and clean laundry. David chose his words carefully this time, softened for an 8-year-old's understanding but honest in a way he hadn't managed to be in years, with anyone. "Before I met your mom," he said, "I was married to someone else. We had a little girl. Her name was Emily. She's grown up now. She'd be a lot older than you, almost 26. But I made some mistakes back then, bud. I wasn't there for her the way I should have been, and I never told you or your mom the truth about it. I should have. I'm sorry." Noah sat very still, processing this the way children do, not all at once, but in pieces, each one landing with its own small weight. "So I have a sister?" he asked finally. "A half-sister, yes. Why didn't you tell me?" It was the same question Claire had asked, and David found he had no better answer for his son than he'd had for his wife. "I was scared," he admitted. "I thought if people knew, they'd think less of me, so I hid it instead. That was wrong." Noah's face did something complicated then, not quite anger, not quite tears, but something in between, the particular grief of a child realizing his father was not the simple, solid thing he'd always assumed. "You lied," Noah said quietly. "This whole time, every day." "I did. Even though lying is bad. You always tell me lying is bad." David didn't try to defend himself against that, didn't offer excuses dressed up as explanations. "You're right," he said. "It is bad, and I did it anyway for a long time because I was a coward. That doesn't make it okay, but I want to fix it, starting now." Noah pulled his knees up to his chest, wrapping his arms around them, quiet for a long moment. When he finally spoke again, his voice was smaller, uncertain in a way that broke something in both his parents. "Is she nice, Emily?" "I don't know yet," David admitted. "But I'd like to find out, together if you want." Later that night, after Noah had finally drifted into an uneasy sleep, Claire sat alone on the back porch, a mug of tea going cold in her hands, watching the dark shapes of trees sway against a sky heavy with clouds. David found her there sometime after 11, hesitating in the doorway before stepping out to join her. "I owe you more than an apology," he said, sitting down beside her. Claire was quiet for a while before she spoke. "I want you to know something," she said finally. "I didn't know about Emily specifically, not the name, not the details, but I knew there was someone, David, a woman, a story, something you carried that you never let me see fully." She turned to look at him. "I told myself it didn't matter, that everyone comes into a marriage with a past, and whatever yours was, it existed before me, and I had no right to dig it up if you weren't ready to hand it over." "You could have pushed harder," David said. "Most people would have. I thought about it, more than once." Her voice wavered slightly. "But every time I got close to asking, I'd watch you with Noah, so patient, so present, such a good father. And I'd think, whatever's back there, it doesn't change who he is now. And I was afraid that if I pulled too hard on the thread, I might unravel something I couldn't put back together. So I stayed quiet. I told myself it was patience. Looking back, I think it was fear." David reached over, tentative, and took her hand. She didn't pull away, though she didn't grip back either. Not yet. 14 years, she said softly, almost to herself. "I carried a question I never let myself ask, and you carried an answer you never let yourself give. I don't know what that makes us, David, but I know it isn't nothing." The days that followed felt strange to David. Lighter in some ways, unbearably heavier in others, as though setting down a burden he'd carried for 14 years had somehow revealed the true size of it for the first time. He'd grown so accustomed to the weight that he'd forgotten what it meant to walk without it. And now, without the secret to hold up around him like scaffolding, he wasn't entirely sure who he was standing on his own. He sat alone in his truck one afternoon, parked outside the hardware store where he'd rented his office for 12 years, and allowed himself finally to think honestly about the man he'd been at 24. Not the softened, forgivable version he'd told himself in the quiet hours of justification, but the real one, a young father who had looked at a crying infant and a failing marriage and chosen deliberately to walk toward the exit instead of through the difficulty. He had told himself so many stories over the years to make that choice survivable, that Rachel was better off without him complicating things. that Emily was too young to remember him anyway, so the damage was minimal, that sending money quarterly was its own form of love, even when the birthday cards had stopped coming and he hadn't heard her voice in over a decade. None of those stories, he understood now, had ever been about protecting Emily. They had been about protecting himself from the unbearable work of showing up imperfectly again and again for a person he'd failed. Honesty, he was beginning to realize, wasn't a single moment of confession at a dinner table or a bedroom door. It was a discipline, a daily choice to keep showing up to the truth even when silence would be easier. He had failed that discipline once already with Emily. He didn't intend to fail it again. Not with Noah, not with Claire, and if he was given the chance, not with the daughter he still barely knew. He started the truck, but before pulling out of the lot, he took out his phone and, for the first time in 11 years, searched a name he had spent just as long trying to forget. Emily answered on the third ring. David hadn't planned exactly what he would say, and in the end, what came out was simple. An apology, unpolished and overdue, followed by an honest admission that he understood if she wanted nothing to do with him. There was a long silence on the line, long enough that he thought she might hang up. She didn't. Instead, quietly, she asked if he'd tell her about the family she'd never met. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet. But it was a door left open where one had been sealed shut for over 2 decades, and David understood that was more than he had any right to expect. At home, life didn't snap back into its old shape, nor did any of them particularly want it to. The old shape, they were beginning to understand, had been built on something hollow. What they built instead was slower, more deliberate. Dinners where questions were no longer treated as threats. A framed photograph eventually placed on the hallway shelf beside Noah's school pictures. A young woman with David's same stubborn jaw, smiling somewhat cautiously into the camera. Noah asked about Emily often in the weeks that followed, with the persistent curiosity that had started all of this in the first place. He wanted to know if she liked dinosaurs too, whether she'd want to meet the puppies once Mr. Halloran's dog finally had them. Small questions, easy ones, the kind that no longer made his father's hands go still. One evening, months later, over another pot of stew, a little too heavy on paprika, David caught himself watching his family, Claire, Noah, and, for the first time, a video call propped against the napkin holder, Emily laughing at something Noah had said. The table was fuller now, and so, finally, was the silence that used to sit at its center.